All right. Thank you all so much for coming. Welcome to the Altadena Library parking lot. My name is Nikki Winslow. I'm the district director and wanted to thank you all for coming today. One of our strongest partnerships is with the Altadena Historical Society, so we were happy to host this event and so glad to see all of you here. I'm assuming everybody's been in our beautiful library. Yes. If not, definitely visit after this program because it's a beautiful mid-century modern building that I get to work in every day. Very lucky. So again, thank you so much, and I don't want to take up any of the program time, so I will introduce Daria Tapoussis from the Historical Society.
Thank you, Nikki. I'm just going to give you a heads up that Paul's going to try not to use the microphone, so if anybody can't hear, just let us know. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Looks like I'm going to have to use it.
Okay.
You guys want to sit?
We've got these two.
Oh, you got this.
Yep. Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about the Historical Society. Since 1935, we have gathered, preserved, and helped publicize names and places in an area steeped in history. We want to encourage your interest, your curiosity, and knowledge of events and people who have shaped this area that we all love. Our mission is to preserve the past, to honor those who have gone before, be they famous or not so notable, and ensure that important events and people are not forgotten. So first of all, I want to thank the library for hosting this event. It's wonderful to see you all in person. It's been a long time since the Historical Society has been able to do any kind of event. And so we're really happy that the library offered up this beautiful space for us on a perfect day. It couldn't be better. So thanks to you all for coming out here. Today we're going to be talking with Paul Rollins, who is the author of a book called Letters from the Sphinx. The way we're going to do this is I'm just going to introduce Paul. He's going to introduce some members of the Allen family who are here and talk a little bit, and then I'm going to ask him some questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you to ask questions as well. Let me tell you a little bit about Paul. Oh, by the way, we will have books available after, so feel free to come up and buy a book, and Paul will be happy to sign it. The proceeds are benefiting the Historical Society, so we appreciate all of you who are helping support us. So let me tell you a little bit about Paul. A native of North Carolina, Paul is a former college writing instructor. A second career in corporate training and organizational development afforded him the opportunity to live in Southern California twice, including Altadena. He is a former officer of the Altadena Historical Society Board of Directors and is a self-described incurable Californian. Now retired, he spends his time writing home and family histories. He lives in Georgia with his husband and 2 dogs. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Daria. I appreciate it. Hello, everybody. It's so nice to see you. I was thinking what Emily, Jane, and William Allen would think about this assemblage this afternoon, 150 years on after they lived on the Mesa. And I'm sure they would be gratified by both your interest and your presence here today. So thank you very much, not only on behalf of the Allens, but also on behalf of the contemporary members of the Allen family. Thanks to Daria and AHS, and specifically Gene Phillips, who put this event together. I appreciate it. Thanks to the Altadena Library. Nikki, appreciate you very much, and Victor Soberg, let him know that we miss him today. Before we get on started, I want to introduce you to the forces behind this book, okay? And they are the Allens of today. There are 3 great-granddaughters here today and 1 great-granddaughter-in-law. Okay, the first granddaughter I'd like to introduce you to is none other than Pat or Patricia Sparacino. Yay! Pat was the guiding spirit in this book, in that she once she vetted me, and she did vet me. Who are you? What do you want? Leave us alone. Okay, maybe. Okay, so that was Pat. Pat is here with her husband, Robert Sparacino. The second member of the family I want to introduce you to is the granddaughter-in-law Mrs. William D. Allen, aka Eldred Allen. Eldred, let everybody know who you are. If you ever write a book about anything and you need somebody to get you organized, get Eldred on your team. Because what she did is she sifted through all the Allen material that had been left to her husband, D. Allen, and we kept the U.S. postal system really active to and from Atlanta to Santa Ana, California, and Eldred shared diary after diary after diary. I don't know how many you sent, but you have more than the Huntington Library. And you also had more account book information than the Huntington. Yes.
But it's going to the Huntington.
But it's going to the Huntington.
It's already said it's going to.
We want everything Allen in one place. Okay. That will make future researchers very happy. They won't have to run all over town. Okay, and I would tell you that your biggest help for me, Eldred, was when you discovered over 200 letters that were written to and from family members. And if I thought the diaries were instrumental and were informative, if I thought the account books were informative, the letters brought everything together because you could hear their voices.
Can you speak a little louder, Paul? It's not on.
I'm sorry?
Your microphone is not
Use it
on.
closer to your face.
What about this?
Hold it close to your mouth.
The letters really brought everything together, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate that.
I've got to say, it was my husband's aunt Emily Allen Stewart. She was the one that really saved everything.
Yeah.
And so we have Aunt Emily really to thank for.
Yeah. Well, pack rats the whole lot of you. Nobody throws anything away in your family. All right? If you ever visit any of these ladies, don't open a closet. Granddaughters, other great-granddaughters would include Moira Auld. Moira, stand up. Moira, you were absolutely instrumental. Your photos, I remember hounding you. We couldn't find pictures of the house in Alexandria from about 1850.
I didn't even know what it was.
No, you didn't even know you had them. You know, and I kept hounding you. Go look for them. Look more. I know they're there. And you finally found them. Congratulations. It filled a void in the book, and I appreciate it. Marcia Cashin, everybody, another great granddaughter.
And we so appreciate you.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you. Thank you for your contributions. There is one other Allen who is not here today, another great-granddaughter her name is Mary Zentisi, and she lives in Spokane, and she could not come down today. But I contacted Mary right in the middle of a household move from Gig Harbor to Spokane, and she relented to my pleas to go look for information. She basically found a box of Allen memorabilia in her garage, and that included all the apprenticeship documents of William Allen from 1837. Now, I don't know what you have in your garage, but I certainly don't have anything like that, you know. And she was kind enough to stop what she was doing and take that under advisement. Okay, so that's basically all I have to do. I wanted to introduce you to these fine ladies who really helped me put this book together. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Daria. We've pre-planned some questions, and I've also taken the liberty of putting my answers on note cards because I'm 75. And anybody that can identify with someone my age, you know that details ultimately begin to slip away from you. So I have note cards to refer to along the way. There's a lot of information packed into the book, so I don't want to shortchange you by giving you half an answer. All right? Are we ready?
Ready.
Good. Yay. Go.
Okay, so I'm going to try to project the questions so we don't have to pass the mic back and forth. So as Paul mentioned, there's a whole part of this book that covers the Allen's time in England and in Egypt, but we're going to selfishly focus our conversation just on Altadena today. So if you're interested in what happened before they got here, I'm going to encourage you to buy the book, and then you can learn all about what happened before they came to our beautiful town. So let me just start by asking you how you got interested in this subject, Paul.
Well, I moved to Altadena in 1995. It was my second trip to California, my second stay in California, and I was so entranced by the topography of Altadena, and I fell in love with my house, which sat right on Eden Canyon, that I decided to do a history of the house, and of course that went into a history of the ownership of the lot. And as everybody knows that knows Altadena history, there's a lot of stuff on Rancho San Pasqual. But in the middle of it, there were these people called the William Allens, who owned over 500 acres of land in northeast Altadena. I turned to the internet, and I found out that there is a website on the internet that directed me back to the United States from Australia, and one thing led to another, and I discovered Mrs. Sparacino here, and that's when our relationship got started. The Allens are mentioned in several Altadena history books. You probably know about Sarah Noble Ives' book, Altadena. You also, more recently, are familiar with the Michelle Zack book, Altadena Between Wilderness and City. They both treat the Allen family, but in diminutive fashion, just little paragraphs here and there. But they both said the same thing about the Allens, that they were the center of Highland social life in the 1880s. So I thought, my God, Party Central. I need to find out more about these people, and that's what kicked off the investigation, because if I were going to do the history of the lot, I needed to flesh out a lot more information about the people that owned the lot from 1879 to 1923. And so that's how the book got started.
It was great to it's great to have the Allen family here and to hear a little bit about how you collected the materials. But I think from a historical society perspective, we're very curious about how did you do the research? What were your sources? So clearly you got some materials from the family. Did you go to the Huntington? How did you do this, the research?
Yeah, before I actually descended upon San Mateo to see Bob and Patricia Sparacino, I went to the Huntington because I needed to show them that I was somewhat serious about the subject matter. So I spent a week at the Huntington, and what I couldn't get to, I photographed. So I had all this material sent, on my cell phone. I would tell you that Pat introduced me to the rest of her cousins. You introduced me to Eldred and Dee. You introduced me to Moira, and Moira subsequently introduced me to Mrs. Cashin. And so that's the way it all came about. I would tell you that 95% of the book is factual. it is based, there's very little extrapolation or interpretation of of the facts of the case. And what I tried to do is I tried to place that in chronological context. It was like a 10,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, but it was loads of fun, and I was able to do that with their help. We sure did keep the USPS busy for about 3 years.
Great. You know, that's one thing that I really liked about this book, by the way, is just the letters and the materials, the accounting that they kept. I mean, it's sort of amazing. So, you know, knowing that the family was probably going to read the book, did that affect what you covered and how you thought about the material?
I'm really glad you asked that question. I can honestly look you in the eye and say not at all. Not at all. They were front and center, very forward with everything. They sent me clippings that weren't so complimentary about the family, and they said, use them, tell the story. And Eldred, you were instrumental in one of those. After William Allen died in 1886, the English system of primogeniture took over, and Emily Jane Allen, the widow, assigned the running of the ranch to their firstborn son, Arthur, from whom Dee is descended, and Moira, Arthur is also your ancestor as well. You sent me a clipping that I would like to read a summary of, if you don't mind. Thank you. I'm so glad you did. Okay, let me find it. Arthur was the first of 10 children. Oh, the third. Excuse me. He was the first.
First living son. First living son.
That's right. Okay. See? Detail. In December 1888, Arthur Allen was charged in the United States District Court with defrauding the government out of its due proportion of tax by making fraudulent returns of the quantity of spirits distilled. According to the charge, Arthur hid a large quantity of distilled spirits from the tax collector and adjusted the books reflecting the number of days the distillery was in operation and the amount of spirits distilled. The charge resulted in the Internal Revenue Service temporarily seizing the winery and the distillery on the Allen property. Luckily, criminal charges were never brought. But juggling the books in an attempt to maintain ranch profitability took its toll on Arthur, and most likely Emily Jane was none too happy. Okay? And as a result, he would go on the following year and wash his hands of the Sphinx entirely and move to Arizona, buying a cattle ranch in Payson, Arizona, where he spent the next 20 years of his life never returning to the Sphinx. He left in 1889 and he returned in 1909.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about William and Emily. Who were they? Let's tell us a little bit about their history.
Well, you think they were interesting. You should have read, hopefully you've read about their forebears by now. William Allen was a member of a family that was heavily involved in the cotton spinning, cotton manufacturing industry in Lancashire, which is up in northern England. And he by about 1820s, his family had 3 manufacturing cotton plants. He was sort of the heir apparent for the Allen family, and they sent him to Egypt in 1837. at a time in which the English cotton trade was on a decline, and the new emergent center of the cotton trade, now catching the traffic east and west, was Alexandria, Egypt. And so they sent him, this 25-year-old guy who had never been like 10 miles away from home, they sent him, put him on a boat, and he went to Alexandria, Egypt. Okay, and he did very, very well. He was shrewd, he was extremely competent at what he did, and by the time he was 40, 42, he had made his fortune. So, good for him. He ultimately then left Egypt and went to Bath. Okay.
Just
Yes.
make sure you're holding the mic next to your...
Louder.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I can't swallow it. Okay, so that's a little bit about William's background. Emily is an altogether different person. She grew up. She was born in Alexandria, Egypt, but her parents were English. She was an expat living in a sort of the Beverly Hills of Alexandria. They called it Ramley, okay? And it's where all the highfalutin, hoity-toity, cosmopolitan types lived, and it was about 3 miles east of Alexandria, and as the book says, a world away from the filth and smells of the city. So that's where she was born. She ultimately, her father was a merchant, but an international merchant. His family way back was connected with the imperial court of Russia, and his uncle was actually a consul general in St. Petersburg. I mean, so they were closely tied to the Russian imperial court. He was a partner in Peel and Sons, which was arguably the largest cotton manufacturer in Alexandria. He was early in Egypt, and he raised quite a large brood, of which Emily was one. And so that's a little bit about him. He, Pat and I laughed. I called Thomas Bell an inept father, because he really didn't have anything much to do with his children. He didn't want to be bothered by them, so he sent them back to England to be educated. But it wasn't long before Emily came back in her teens, and by then she was the head of household. She buried a mother, she buried a stepmother, and she buried several siblings. And by then, at 16 years old, she was ostensibly the lady of the house. So, I mean, she had both a charmed and a rough beginning in life. So that's a little bit about them. They went on to have 10 children, one of whom died in infancy in Egypt. A nurse dropped him on the head, and apparently he died of a cerebral hemorrhage within the first year of his life. But they had plenty of others, and most of them, all of them, came to live in Altadena. Okay?
So that's a great segue to the next question, which is, here's this British couple and their children living in Egypt. How did they come all the way to Altadena?
2 reasons. If any of you, and I'm sure many of you have read on the history of Altadena, have you ever heard of the book by Charles Nordhoff? It's called Southern California, or California for Health, Wealth, and Pleasure, and it was published in 1872. it was sort of the Portnoy's complaint of its day, in that it was a tremendous bestseller. And William actually took notes on the book, and he became enchanted with the San Gabriel Valley based on what Charles Nordhoff talked about. He called it the best place in California for a farmer. And he encouraged people like William to visit the region. And William actually did that for the first time alone, and I might say in poor health, in very poor health. He did that in 1878. Now imagine him coming across the ocean. 12 days it took him across the ocean, and across country from New York to San Francisco. New York to San Francisco probably about a week, but it took him much longer because he got sick in Sacramento. He got sick in San Francisco. He had to have physicians wait on him. We think it was angina because he had a heart condition, but he finally made it after about 3 weeks to Southern California. One of the first things he did was to visit a cousin who lived right around El Monte. He had an orchard in El Monte, and his name was Sidney Asplin. And Sidney basically sold, if you will, William on the wonders and glories of farming in the San Gabriel Valley. So that's how he got here. He never looked at any place else other than the San Gabriel Valley.
And so tell us a little bit, where was the land he bought that would become the Sphinx Ranch?
It's sketchy because there was a lot of land deals, swapping land deals to this person and to that person, and so it's sort of hard. You have to sort of be somewhat schizophrenic to keep track of the acreage at any one particular time. Overall, I can say that he bought a total of 502 acres, but he only bought 200 to start with. And the 200 acres basically started the southern boundary was the current New York Drive. Okay? And you entered the ranch from the south on New York Drive. But in short order, and I'm not talking about months, I'm talking about days, he bought 250 acres from James Craig, and then he bought from the Southern Pacific Railway and from the U.S. government the land that runs up the mountains, you know. And so before it was all said and done, he had over 500 acres. If you want to put it on a map, the southern border of the Sphinx Ranch would have been New York. The top portion of the ranch, they say the base of the San Gabriel Mountains, but it was actually the most eastern portion of Loma Alta, okay? And from Allen in the west to Eaton Canyon in the east. So you have that big block. And then, of course, right below him was Fair Oaks, where the Cranks bought their property from, what's his name?
Baldwin?
No, you know him. Benjamin Eaton. See, I told you, the gray cells don't connect. Okay, so, you know, that was the extent of their property. That was the most they ever held at one time, and they slowly began to diminish their properties. For most of the time they were there until they really got serious about selling off. They owned over 400 acres.
Wow. So what was Altadena like? What was Pasadena like when they came? Pasadena
was, well, we all know about the Indiana colony. And I would tell you that east of Lake there wasn't much. Because the Indiana colony basically set out their lots. The Mutual Orchard Company from Oakland laid out the largest orange grove in the world. They planted 14,000 orange trees. So, I mean, east of that, there was nothing. There was chaparral, dirt, ragged wagon ruts, and that was about it. As far as it was Altadena, and what was the other one?
Pasadena.
That was Pasadena. As far as Altadena was concerned, the Allens really didn't pay any attention to Altadena because Altadena was still largely rancho, very sparsely settled, and so they didn't consider themselves Altadenans until the 1920s. They considered themselves instead San Gabriel residents. And you say, well, why not Pasadena? Well, Pasadena, it took them, they had to go a mile further down the road to get to Pasadena. And the San Gabriel had a general store, a trading post. They also had an early post office, which was important to them. So, I mean, after all was said and done, it offered them everything that that they wanted and needed at that point in time. So it was San Gabriel, and then in the late 1880s, they identified more as Lamanda Park. And if you're ever lucky enough to find a Mountain Company wine label, it says Lamanda Park, and they addressed their letters, their return addresses, and their stationery all said Sphinx Ranch, Lamanda Park. But all of this, you couldn't stop the creeping effect of Altadena. And it was not until 1911, with the creation of the Altadena Country Club and the Altadena Country Club Park. You think of the Balian Mansion, all of that was Altadena Country Club Park, and suddenly they found Altadena knocking on their door. And they could not ignore that any longer because that paved the way for the selling of the ranch.
So you told us about William coming over. When did Emily join, and did the kids all come, all 9 kids? Did they all
No, they didn't. Emily did not accompany William on his first trip in 1878. He was 5.5 months here, scouting out a place to buy. Many historians will tell you that he decided on buying the Sphinx Ranch, which was then called Mountain Home Ranch, from W.W. Edwards, that he would buy. He bought that before he left, but he didn't. He actually didn't complete the sale until his first day back in California in Los Angeles in 1879. Okay, and that's well documented. The records in Norwalk substantiate that. He paid $18,500 in gold coin because they didn't use paper money back then, and if you used paper money, it was subject to exorbitant exchange rates. So gold coin it was. So he was the sole person in 1878. In 1879, William came with 10 of his closest friends, okay, and he rented 4 berths amidships on the Cunard Parthia line, and that was to accommodate himself and Emily, all but his eldest 3 sons, who were in school, in boarding school in Lancashire, England, or I guess they call it Lancaster, England. And then he brought two English, basically servants. One was a governess who almost became like a daughter, and the other was a nurse. Because the children were still fairly young, and unbeknownst, Emily would soon have her 10th and final child in 1880 right here. Okay, so her childbearing years extended from, extended from 1860 to 1880. 10 children. Aren't you glad you weren't her?
3 continents. You think about that. That's 3 continents.
Yeah, 3 continents.
Wow.
Absolutely. Okay, so, and they also brought Sidney Asplin's younger sister, who came to visit her brother in El Monte, but she did not remain here for long. She went back to England. So that was the story of who came and went as they kept the oceans churning between Liverpool and New York.
Great. So tell us a little bit about the ranch. What were they growing? I mean, I was kind of blown away, did not realize myself that there were wine growers or grape growers for wine here. So tell us a little bit about what they were growing on the ranch.
Well, obviously their 2 primary crops were grapes. They had numerous vineyards, and and oranges. And those are the productivity of the Sphinx in terms of those 2 crops is heavily documented in the account books that I was so blessed to receive. However, they grew a lot more, and we only know that by inference because there were no account books to really speak to the other crops which they grew. Apples, pears, lemons, limes, apricots, walnuts. I mean, so they had a virtual farmer's market all in one place. But unfortunately, as I said, we don't have any of their that data on any of those other crops that have filtered down to today.
And were they making wine? I'm fascinated about the wine. Sorry, I've got booze on my brain. Were they making the wine themselves or bottling it? Were they?
Initially, they did not. They sent all of their wine for processing to a winery called Sunny Slope, which you may know about. But after 1885, William built his own winery, and they started producing wine under the Mountain Wine Co. label. And I would tell you that the one thing I read about the Allens in the other histories is that they achieved a maximum tonnage of grapes off the farm in 1904 of a little over 600 tons of grapes, and by 1906, though, 2 years later, the ranch had basically ceased grape production at that point in time. But it's interesting to note that the year that William Allen acquired the ranch from Edwards, Dr. W.W. Edwards, the Pacific Rural Press, which was a very popular publication, agricultural publication, listed the Sphinx Ranch as the 6th largest producer of grapes in the San Gabriel Valley. And the San Gabriel Valley was the single largest producer of grapes in California. So it was big industry here. But then that got wiped out. 1884, if you go home and somebody asks you what you learned at the talk on the Sphinx Ranch, I want you to tell them you learned all about the glassy winged sharpshooter. because the glassy-winged sharpshooter was part of the decline of the San Gabriel Valley grape industry. What they did, these little insects buried in the ground and destroyed the roots so that the roots could not absorb water. And by 1886, the grapes, the vineyards in San Gabriel Valley, from Anaheim on through, were completely destroyed. William Allen survived, largely by the proximity of his ranch high on the hills, and even though he was affected by it, he was not totally wiped out. And he did a lot of home remedies with soap and lye and everything else that he sprayed on his vines. I guess they were homemade remedies, but they worked.
But didn't the glassy-winged sharpshooters affect the oranges? Because that's what they are now.
I didn't read about that it was predominantly the grapes that they infested, and at a time when the San Gabriel wines were beginning to rival the competitors, in England, in France and Italy. So they almost got there. But by the 1890s, guess where the wine market in Southern California shifted? North. So when you talk about California wine now, you think of Napa and Sonoma, maybe San Ysidro. Okay, by the 1890s, the wine production in Northern California was 6.5 times the grape production in Southern California. So they really took off, but they took off at the expense of the disease which attacked the Southern California vines.
So I'm going to ask maybe a couple more questions and then we'll open it up to the audience. So one question I'm curious about, in the book you talk about there were laborers from Japan and China and Mexico who are all working at the ranch. Were those all at different times? Could you tell us a little bit more about the laborers?
They were pretty simultaneous. Obviously, after the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, you had an influx of Chinese labor. So it was not an uncommon sight to see people in Chinese dress and queues down their backs on the streets of Pasadena. They were both good for farm labor as well as domestic labor as well. And Emily and William basically hired two house people, one to cook and one to clean. A lot of people say they had three, but they only had two. Now you ladies will love this. They hired a washer, a Chinese washerwoman, and she showed up every 2 weeks to wash clothes for a family of 9. And she charged them $4. Chinese labor didn't fare any better back then. They earned $1 a day. $1 a day. So what was the deal with the Chinese labor was that even though they were extolled for their honesty and their work ethic, once you showed them how to do a task, they never deviated from it. Even if circumstances dictated they should, they continued to do things exactly like they had always done it. Well, sometimes circumstances dictate a different approach. And so from then on, William and Emily got a little wiser, and they hired Mexican labor. And the Mexican labor they put in charge of not only picking the fruit, but also pruning the vines. Later on in life, Emily hired Japanese labor for the kitchen. And you'll just have to excuse Mrs. Allen. because you can't look from a 2021 perspective and look back to the 1880s and put your own moral sense on things, because it wasn't part of the culture. But Emily was none too forgiving of their Japanese kitchen staff, and she stopped trying to remember them by name. She just called them number 1 and number 2. You know, so that was sort of the way. But she also really rebelled when, later on in the 1880s, when there was a backlash against the Chinese here in Southern California. It was all over, and she wrote her son that she was appalled by the treatment of the Chinese. So she was a little bit complex in the way she looked at health. But she had had help all her life. She could still cook, though.
Great. So there's so many good details in this book, so I just really want to encourage you to get a copy. But so the last question I will ask is, what happened to the Sphinx property? What happened to the house they lived in?
Unfortunately, you know, this gentleman lives in the old crank house that was built in 1882, right? The Hermitage survived in some shape with moderation. I mean, it was remodeled periodically. Unfortunately, Brigden's Highland Ranch built in 1891, was razed, and so was the Sphinx Ranch House in 1928. It was sitting right in the middle of a development, of a housing development. The first one was by Hogan and Company, and that was all of Altadena Country Club Park. Sphinx Ranch House survived that, but in 1923, with the purchase of the rest of the acreage from Midwick all the way down to New York, the Sphinx Ranch House was a sitting target. And basically, if you want to know where the Sphinx House was located, we all know Pepper Drive. So it was at 1830 Pepper. Okay, and one of their sons, Walter. One of their sons, Walter, basically built a home later on. He built 2 houses, but the second house he built was right on the property on which the Sphinx Ranch was located. So 1830 Pepper, you know, you might want to take a look at that. They're pretty cautious. I always drive by and slow down, and I always get these looks about what are you doing out in front of my house? So be careful.
Yeah.
All right, great. So thank you very much, Paul. This is great.
One of the reasons why they didn't want to associate with Pasadena was because they were growing the grapes and alcohol in Pasadena's dry.
Later when Pasadena started an annexation campaign because they were so concerned about the rowdies who were hitting the saloons every night, that it being the puritanical folk that the Pasadenans were, not like us bohemians up here in the hills, they began to make noises about annexing Altadena into the city limits of Pasadena. And people like William Allen, Craig, Crank, Brigden, all of those were dead set against that. And they were able to mount a defense that stopped that annexation attempt. But Pasadena kept trying, and they tried multiple times, but to no avail. Yay! And that's why you're unincorporated today.
That's it, today.
Yes.
How did the Sphinx Ranch get its name of Sphinx?
That's really interesting. Everybody says in the histories that due to William Allen's long association with Egypt. So imagine my surprise when I read in one of William's letters to one of his sons back in boarding school in England, he said, "We've named the ranch the Sphinx Ranch. It is a name that I don't like very much." So that sort of opens the door. I would say probably family vote, was the way it got its name. But he wasn't particularly taken with it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
The book emphasizes this, but I think the water issue was the big one. And I went, for example, at the Huntington and looked at the original deed for Fair Oaks Ranch. And the borders are very big.
The borders are very what?
Vague. It's
Yeah.
so many feet to a rock and da-da-da-da. And you think, how could you ever figure this out?
Yeah.
However, the rights to the Eaton Canyon water was very, very specific.
Yeah, very controlled.
Because it didn't really matter if you had land and you didn't have any water, you were out of luck.
Yeah. Well, it's like the settling of Southern California, including Los Angeles. Water is life. And, that really restricted the amount of cultivated land in Southern California by virtue of water rights. But there is an original 1869 agreement that was filed in Los Angeles Superior Court, in which Eaton, of Canyon fame, Craig, and a previous owner, let's just put it that way, of the Sphinx Ranch were entitled to all water flowing into San Pasqual and Santa Anita ranchos. I mean, get a deal like that, would you? And so, but that was amended in 1879 when with William Allen buying the property, and with Crank selling half of his Fair Oaks Ranch to Albert Brigden. He also bought the Ellis property that was just below Fair Oaks, and with that they had to draw up another agreement. The best thing that I can tell you is the Sphinx Ranch was entitled to 3/14 of the water flowing southerly in wooden 10-inch square wooden flumes. Now, I had this idea of what those wooden flumes were, but then I had the opportunity to visit AHS, their office, yesterday, and somebody must have slipped some pictures under their door. They didn't know where they came from, and they showed the flumes. And the flumes were basically wooden boxes. Now, they didn't hold that much water. I mean, they leaked, but the majority of the water got down to the ranch lands. And they were attached to the rock walls, probably with some type of steel spikes. And when I was living here on Eaton Canyon, there was part of that flume still left in my backyard, and my next door neighbor had a really nice example of how they channeled the water in her backyard. So it was very interesting to see that. I really invite you to take a look at AHS and what they've got. It was enlightening.
Yes.
Paul? Jane
Hi.
Brackman? Jane Brackman.
Jane! Hi, I didn't know you were coming.
I had a question regarding the water. What about the water irrigation ditches that go right along New York? How do those come into play with the Sphinx Ranch?
They came into play in 1896. Okay, basically when the county of Los Angeles tried to get the Allens to fund an east-west corridor north of Villa. which turned out to be New York Avenue or New York Drive. And they promised that they would dig the ditches and channel the water that way. But the Allens refused. Always very savvy when it came to business dealings. They did not go for that deal. They said that they would put up half the money for New York Drive if the county would put up the other half. And for that they received $1,682 from the county. So they profited. But if you're asking further down about the water source, that was, to my knowledge, not within the purview of the Allens' tenure on the Mesa.
Okay, Mary, the last question.
Mary.
Hello.
Hey, again. I knew you were going to get in trouble.
Yeah. I wanted to know, you said in about 1920, that's when the Allens decided that maybe Altadena was okay. That house was the first year, I guess, after the pandemic and the war, and Christmas Tree Lane was lit that year too.
Okay.
So I was wondering, did any of those things have anything to do with it, or did they just decide to come in because that was a good thing to do in 1920?
I guess I'll take door number 2.
Okay.
None of, like I said, I stayed very close to the detail that was provided in the diaries and letters and account books. And that was never mentioned. It's a very easy thing, especially when you're an author, to try to conclude things that may or may not have been true. And we've all lived long enough and dealt with so much human nature in the process that we know that A and B does not necessarily equal C. So I refrained from jumping to conclusions and left that out.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Paul, for talking to us about your book.
Thank you.
Paul, we've got some books for sale. If you already have a copy or you want to buy a copy, Paul is happy to sign your books. So come on up. And as Paul mentioned, the Altadena Historical Society has very rich archives of lots of information about Altadena's past, so feel free to reach out to any of us if you're interested in learning more.
Let me mention one more thing before you go. There will be a new book out next year, and it is in the process of being put together now. Greg McReynolds is one of those putting that together, and it is The Ranches of East Pasadena. Obviously, Sphinx will be treated in that, but so will Brigden's Ranch, Highland Ranch, so will Crank's Ranch, and so will Kenaloa. Kenny's Ranch be included in that. So watch for that. It's coming, and it's going to be a very, very nice book.
Thank you.